Hello and welcome to Season 2 of the Chair's Corner from the Department of Medicine at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I am Dr. Ron Falk, Chair of the Department, and the host of this podcast where we're dedicated to empowering patients like you with knowledge about your condition, enhancing your quality of life every step of the way, each and every day. Today we invite Dr. Anil Gehi, the Sewell Family McAllister Distinguished Professor of Medicine in our Division of Cardiology, and he's here today to discuss tech wearables, things like watches and rings, and how they're associated with your health. Dr. Gehi is also the director of the Clinical Cardiology Electrophysiology Service, wiring in the heart, the electrical part of the heart. His research looks into advanced treatments for atrial fibrillation, for one, and using big data to improve patient care. Welcome, Anil Gehi.
Thanks, Ron, for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you. You also need to know that if I ever have a electrophysiology question, a rhythm disturbance question, Dr. Gehi is the first person that I reach out to. So let's get his advice on what the lay of the land is on all of these new things that we get to wear, things that seem to track not just heart rate and our EKGs, but all sorts of other things. So let's start with the landscape of what can I put on myself? What can I wear?
There's been a huge surge in development and technologies, and a lot of this is in the consumer wearable space. And we've seen an explosion of devices, anything from wristbands, things like Fitbits, smart watches, the Apple Watch, the Garmin watch. There's other devices that are wrist-worn. There's rings, the OuraRing you might have heard of. There's even devices that are embedded in clothing that can detect various biometric data.
So let's divide these then, just for simplicity for now. Things that one could wear on one's wrist, things that one could wear on one's finger, and then a plethora of a whole bunch of other intriguing technological things that I probably don't want to buy but are out there for me to think about. So what do these devices actually measure?
Yeah, great question. So I think you have to think about it from the point of view of what sensors are available and then how can we embed them in a device. So I think some of the most basic sensors that are out there are, for example, an accelerometer. Essentially, it's a crystal that's in the device that has a change in electrical charge when it's moved, and that can be then translated into movement, and we can measure things like step counts and physical activity. If you combine that with the GPS that's in a lot of devices, you can even get more information, things like track your distance, you can track altitude changes, you can track velocity. So this can be very sophisticated, and you could use it to essentially measure activity of all sorts. Those are in all sorts of devices. They've been around in watches. They've been in bands like Fitbits for many, many years. I think another important sensor that's in a lot of devices is this technology that we get a lot of use out of called photoplethysmography.
Oh, say that twice.
Yes, yeah, right. We call it PPG for short, okay? And basically, it's the same idea as what's in like a pulse ox. Like you probably most people in your audience are aware of devices that go in the finger and measure your oxygen levels. Essentially, what's happening there is there's a device that's shining a light, usually it's an LED light, onto the skin, and it detects the pulsations in the skin. And it can take that pulsation information and use that to basically calculate heart rate. So it just measures the rapidity of the pulsations in the skin and can use that to calculate a heart rate. And that is used in all sorts of devices. If you think about the wrist-worn devices like an Apple Watch or Garmin watch, essentially you might notice if you were to look at the underside that it will shine a light onto your skin periodically. And that light gets then reflected back to the watch, and it can sense the pulsations in the skin and use that to detect heart rate. So that can be very useful for measuring things like slow heart rates, fast heart rates. We can take that and look at patterns of heart rates and detect various rhythm problems. And then you could use that heart rate information and also look at things like heart rate recovery, which is an important parameter for conditioning of a person as they're going through like a fitness program or a conditioning program. We can look at something called heart rate variability to look at kind of changes in heart rate that are beat to beat. So the PPG essentially can be translated to many, many things. Another important sensor that's embedded in some of these devices is ECG. Okay, so rather than just look at the pulsation and calculate heart rate,
electrocardiogram.
yes, electrocardiogram. So rather than just look at the rate, you can actually look at the electrical activity. So essentially, to do an ECG, you need to have two electrodes touching the skin and measure the electrical activity between those two electrodes and go through some filtering processing to be able to basically produce an ECG, something like you might get in the office. In multiple leads, we can do with a single lead and with particular devices.
Let me just go back for a minute. For the audience, your heart is a muscle with 4 chambers, and those chambers pump in an incredibly well-organized fashion because of the electrical impulses that are produced by this system, this electrical system that you are now describing being able to be measured in the office with an EKG machine, but now, rather than all those leads, just 2 electrodes on the skin.
That's right. So if we take 2 electrodes and apply them to the skin, you generally need to be on opposite limbs or somewhat spread far apart such that the heart is in between. So they can't just be 2 electrodes like on one limb, for example.
On one watch.
Right. It could not be. It could be. So if you think about how an Apple Watch does an ECG, essentially one electrode is on the back of the watch touching the skin. And then to do an ECG, you have to actively put your finger on the dial. And when you put your finger on the dial, that's essentially an electrode on your opposite arm with the electrode on the back of the watch. And so now you have 2 electrodes on opposite arms, and you can measure electrical activity between your arms. Your heart is between your arms. And so you can therefore get a one-lead ECG.
This is really an important concept for everybody listening to understand. If you don't use on an Apple Watch that part of the device that actually forces you to measure heart rate by putting your finger from the opposite hand, your opposite arm, on that button, you're not going to get an accurate reading.
Exactly. So the way the watch and most watches will look at rhythm problems continuously is by using that first technology I talked about, PPG, where what it's doing is it's looking at the pulsations in the skin and interpreting what the rhythm rate is, what the rate is or the rhythm is by the regularity and the speed of those pulsations. It's not actually looking at the electrical activity itself. To measure the electrical activity itself, you need to have 2 electrodes. It can only be done kind of actively, so point of care, you have to put your finger on it, and then you get it. So you're not getting continuous ECG with a watch. There are devices out there where you can get continuous ECG, but those are things like a chest strap that you have under your skin where there's 2 electrodes on the chest all the time, and you can get an ECG that way. And so for that reason, PPG is not going to be as accurate for determining the actual rhythm. It's going to be able to tell you rate, and you can get some interpretation of rhythm by looking at the regularity of it, but it's not going to be as accurate as, say, an ECG.
And there are things that humans do to themselves or diseases do to humans that would alter the accuracy, I suppose, of these measures.
Right. So PPG, for example, again, one of probably the most common sensor that's out there, is quite good when you're at rest. But as you become more active and your heart rate is going through more fluctuations, or say there are some changes to your skin, maybe you're sweaty, maybe your device is not contacting your skin as well, maybe your skin is dry. I mean, those sorts of conditions are going to make the accuracy of the PPG sensor less. Especially some people have irregularities of their heart rate that make it difficult for the device to detect heart rate. So there are a variety of conditions that can make PPG less accurate.
And darker skin tones are one of those factors that can also alter.
That's right.
Obesity, there are several that.
That's right. Temperature of your skin, darker skin tones, motion, and therefore not having good contact with the device. Those are all going to make it less accurate. And for that reason, many times when you're exercising, your heart rate may not be as accurately detected.
Let's talk then, in addition to the ability to measure rate, to measure an EKG equivalent if you put your finger on the dial or you wear a chest strap. Another real measure that you folks think about is how fast the heart recovers after exercise is stopped. Can you chat about with that?
Yeah, so one measure of a person's fitness is heart rate recovery. So there are a number of studies dating back to when we were doing a lot of treadmill testing on patients to look at recovery after exercise, and demonstrated that a person who is less fit, less conditioned, is going to have a slower heart rate recovery. So you can look, for example, at the time it takes for the heart rate to drop by, say, 20 points. And if it drops by, say, 20 points in a minute, that's very good heart rate recovery. If it takes longer to drop, that's poor heart rate recovery. And that can be an indication of a person's physical fitness. And it's one of the things that we'll measure if somebody's, say, going through a cardiac rehab program.
Okay, let's be a little bit more specific here because I can feel our listeners are going to start freaking out here. So let me go through this more slowly. In somebody who is a conditioned athlete, who's running up and down the basketball court constantly, their heart rate from a peak during exercise and now at full rest should recover how much over what period of time?
Yeah, so it's hard to give you a hard and fast number.
But give me an estimate.
So an estimate. So if somebody is in very good physical condition, their heart rate at peak to rest would recover by about 15 to 20 beats per minute within a minute. And these are the kinds of things that somebody who's really into fitness and, say, a competitive athlete is going to monitor a little bit more.
Let's talk now about one of your favorite subjects, and that is heart rhythm. Because these devices can help us with that.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the major use cases for these devices is, again, using the PPG, you can monitor heart rate, and you can look at changes in heart rate and changes in the regularity of the heart rate. So, for example, if somebody's heart rate is, say, going along at 60 beats a minute, and then all of a sudden their heart rate jumps to 150 beats per minute, something probably abnormal is going on.
Boom, 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 right. Boom, 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 boom.
Exactly. And so since if you are wearing a device like a watch or a ring that can detect heart rate using a PPG-type sensor, it can alert you that your heart rate has suddenly changed, and they call that a tachyarrhythmia. You can, if you have a watch like one of these devices, you can go and look, and you can see, oh, look, there was a sudden change in heart rate. It's a tachyarrhythmia. That might be of concern.
It went from a steady beat to an accelerated, a faster rate.
Right, and it's important to think about how quickly the change happened. So, for example, if somebody exercises, it's normal for your heart rate to gradually increase. But if it suddenly changes, 60, now it's 150, that's probably something abnormal. It's not a person that's just simply exercising or walking up the stairs. And very similarly, you can look at slow rhythms. We call that bradyarrhythmias. So if somebody's heart rate is normally 70, all of a sudden it's now 30, that might be something abnormal, and a watch or some other device could alert you to that. There are other heart rhythm disturbances that a device can alert you to, atrial fibrillation being one of the most common. So atrial fibrillation is probably the most common heart rhythm disorder, and its hallmark is that the heart rate is irregular. It has an irregular pattern.
Okay, so Anil, sound it out for us.
Yes. Okay. So a normal rate is going to be bum, 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 bum. It might be faster, it might be slower, but it's going to be steady. Bum, bum, bum. AFib might be bump, 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 bump. It's irregular. And that irregularity is a hallmark of atrial fibrillation. Now, it's not only atrial fibrillation. There are other conditions that can cause an irregular heart rhythm, but AFib is the most common. And a device which has a PPG sensor can therefore detect atrial fibrillation. And what we can talk about maybe a little bit later about one of the ways we use these devices is that AFib is a condition that sometimes has no symptoms. And having a device that can detect a condition that has no symptoms may be something very useful.
Last but not least, all of these devices claim that they can tell you how you are sleeping. Whether you have sleep apnea, whether you're restless, whether you're having deep sleep, whether you're having REM sleep, help.
Yeah. Again, very, very controversial and hard to know how good these are because, again, these are direct-to-consumer devices. They, for the most part, are not studied in a medical-type scenario. Of course, the gold standard for measuring sleep quality and things like sleep apnea is an in-lab test with things like brainwave assessment, eye movement, muscle activity, ECG, pulse oximeter. You have to have all of that together to get a gold standard assessment of sleep. But these devices can estimate. They look at things like heart rate. They look at movement. They can look at other indicators of sleep apnea. So, for example, they can, if they had information on pulse oximeter, they can look at changes in pulse oximetry during sleep, and they can come up with perhaps a rudimentary assessment of sleep quality. They may claim much more, but until we have studies that compare these to the gold standard, it's hard to really know what to make of it.
There's a lot of other perhaps uses that may or may not have as much research behind it. So, for example, there's a lot of buzz online about rings that can be used for women that are supposedly can track fertility, sleep data. They promise all sorts of potential feedback information. What should we think about that whole group of possibilities?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to know what to make of these. Remember, again, these are direct-to-consumer devices. They take the basic sensors I've spoke of, heart rate, maybe temperature, maybe movement. Take that volume of information and try to interpret all sorts of stuff. They have their own proprietary algorithm that might say, try to make a determination on fertility, or they might make a determination on sleep quality, or they might make a determination on your stress level. We don't know what's in the black box. We don't really know what they're doing. These have not been studied in any rigorous way, so it's really hard to know what to make of it.
Anil, I'm walking down the street. I've been exercising, and, I'm a little short of breath, so I've just paused for a minute. But I feel really good, and I start walking fast again, and all of a sudden my watch goes crazy, an alert of some kind. What should I do?
Yeah, great question. So there are a variety of different kinds of alerts you can get, but I think probably the things that people might sense most often is tachyarrhythmia alerts, meaning the watch detected a fast heart rate.
What should I do about it, though?
Yeah, so it sort of depends on how a person feels. If a person feels okay, not in an emergent situation. So an emergent situation might be significant chest pain, significant shortness of breath, or feeling like
I feel fine.
Yeah. If you feel fine, I think that's something to take note of and alert your doctor, because tachyarrhythmias, fast heart rhythms, can happen at any time, and they are something that sometimes have consequences. For example, a very common tachyarrhythmia is atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation being an abnormal heart rhythm where the heart is beating in an irregular fashion, and it can have consequences like putting somebody at risk for developing blood clots in the heart and strokes. It can have consequences of causing shortness of breath or lightheaded spells or chest pain. And these are things that may not need to be addressed in an emergency type scenario, but should certainly be followed up on with your doctor.
There are times when these devices are life-saving, and let's talk about some of those. If you have an elderly parent that's living alone, or even a not so elderly human who's walking along and they fall, these devices actually have algorithms that can help. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think this is some of the most fascinating things about these devices is how these are going to come into play with our kind of day-to-day of assessments of health and assessments of emergency situations. So you've probably seen how some of these devices have fall detector algorithms built in. And essentially, they have a gyroscope of some sort in the device that can measure changes in position. They can measure changes in movement. And if you feed all that information into an algorithm, eventually you can develop a fall detector. And these are actually quite good. In fact, there was a day that my mother fell at home, and I was alerted by her watch. And I was able to call her and see that she was okay, and it was pretty impressive that these things work. And I think those are some interesting use cases that these devices are really going to revolutionize. And there can be many others that you can imagine. One thing that I'm really looking forward to is how this can revolutionize the determination of events that can be associated with a sudden death. Think about a patient who, say, is in their home and has a cardiac arrest. So their heart suddenly goes into an abnormal rhythm, they pass out, and they would die if somebody doesn't see this, start doing CPR, call 911, and hopefully the paramedics get to them quickly. Many sudden cardiac arrest events happen in the home when somebody might be alone or a person with them is not able to do CPR. Maybe they haven't been trained or whatnot. These devices could potentially revolutionize that because remember, if you have a device on your wrist monitoring your heart rate all the time, and of course these devices have the capability of calling 911, perhaps that can detect an event and be able to interpret whether this is a life-threatening condition and bypass all those steps that are necessary to activate the paramedics. That could potentially really revolutionize care. Of course, there's a lot of things, a lot of steps that have to happen before that can be, something that is in the real world. There's a lot of organizations of systems that need to come into play for that to happen. Of course, we need to make sure that this is an accurate type assessment. But we can imagine ways that can happen. In fact, think about other sensors that are in our environment. Think about your smart speaker, your Amazon Alexa in your kitchen or in your bedroom. That can listen to noises in your environment, and it can actually, there are studies showing that your Amazon Alexa smart speaker can hear agonal breathing. So agonal breathing is that sort of kind of labored, gasping breathing that happens when somebody is in a severe emergency type situation. They may be having a cardiac arrest. They might have an abnormal breathing pattern. These devices can actually hear that. And you can imagine that you can take that, incorporate it into some other say, a watch on their wrist, put all these things together. A machine learning algorithm could put all that stuff together and say, something bad is happening. I better alert somebody.
Although I worry that Alexa's listening to all sorts of things that I don't want Alexa to listen to. Dr. Gehi, thank you so very, very much for sharing your incredible expertise on all of these wearable tech devices. And you have really illuminated this area for us incredibly well. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me.